My husband left behind a $28 million inheritance and a skyscraper. But the moment I discovered who truly wanted a piece of his legacy, I realized the biggest danger was not losing the money. It was losing the people I trusted most. The day my husband died, I lost the person I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. But I never imagined that his death would also reveal a truth about the people I trusted most. A truth so painful that, years later, I still struggle to understand how quickly everything changed. Because when my husband was alive, I knew exactly who my family was. Or at least, I thought I did. I knew the people who hugged me during holidays. I knew the people who sat at our dinner table. I knew the people who told me, "If you ever need anything, we will always be here." But I learned something after my husband was gone. Sometimes, the hardest betrayal does not come from strangers. Sometimes, it comes from the people who already know your heart, the people who know your weaknesses, the people who know exactly where it hurts. And the most frightening part? I didn't discover this because someone confessed the truth. I discovered it because money entered the room. And when millions of dollars became part of the conversation, I started seeing people differently. Welcome to When Family Breaks. Here, we explore the moments when love, family, trust, and money collide, revealing the hidden sides of human nature that many people never expect to see. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories that make you think deeper about relationships, wealth, and the decisions that shape our lives, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful stories like this one. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Before the money, before the conflict, before I questioned the people closest to me, there was only love. My husband was not just a successful man. To the outside world, he was someone who had built an impressive life. People saw the achievements, they saw the properties, they saw the opportunities, they saw the numbers. But I saw something different. I saw the man who came home after a long day and wanted nothing more than a quiet evening together. I saw the person who knew my fears before I even said them out loud. I saw the person who made ordinary moments feel important. The world knew him for what he built. I knew him for who he was. And when he passed away, everything I thought I understood about my future disappeared overnight. Grief changes the way you see the world. The things that once seemed important suddenly become meaningless. The conversations you thought you would have tomorrow become conversations you will never have. The plans you made together become memories that only one person carries. I remember those first days after his death. The house felt different. The silence felt heavier. Every room reminded me that someone who had always been there was suddenly gone. And during that time, I believed one thing would remain unchanged: family. I believed the people around me would become my support system. I believed they would help me stand when I felt like I could barely breathe. And at first, that was exactly how it looked. People came to check on me. People offered their support. People told me they were there for me. But slowly, almost unnoticed, something started changing. The conversations became different. The questions became different. The energy around me became different. At first, I didn't want to believe it, because when you love someone, you don't immediately suspect the people they loved. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself, maybe they are just trying to help. Maybe they are just concerned. Maybe I am overthinking because I am grieving. And maybe that is why these situations are so complicated, because the people who hurt us the most are often the people we least expect. After my husband's passing, I discovered that he had left behind something much larger than I ever imagined: a significant inheritance, a fortune valued at around $28 million. And along with it came ownership connected to a massive real estate asset, a skyscraper that represented years of work, planning, and ambition. To many people, those things represented success. They represented freedom. They represented a dream. But standing in the middle of my grief, I didn't see them that way. I saw responsibility. I saw complicated decisions. I saw something that could either protect the future my husband worked for or create problems that nobody was prepared to handle. Because there is something people rarely talk about when they talk about wealth. They talk about earning money. They talk about becoming successful. They talk about having more. But they don't always talk about what happens when wealth becomes the center of attention. They don't talk about the pressure, the expectations, the sudden appearance of opinions from people who were never involved before. And that was the moment I realized something important. Money does not just change what you have. Sometimes, it changes how people look at you. Before anyone knew the full details, I was simply a grieving wife, a person who had lost someone she loved. But once people started realizing the size of what my husband had left behind, the situation began to feel different. I started feeling like I was no longer being seen only as a person. I was being seen as someone connected to something valuable. And that feeling is difficult to explain unless you have experienced it. It is the moment when you begin asking yourself questions you never wanted to ask. Do they care about me? Or do they care about what I represent? Would things feel the same if there was no money involved? Those questions are painful because they force you to look at relationships from a completely different perspective. And eventually, I made a decision. I decided to keep certain details private until I could fully understand the situation. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, not because I wanted to take something away from anyone, but because, for the first time in my life, I understood that protecting yourself is not the same as being selfish. Sometimes, when your life changes suddenly, you need time to think. You need time to understand. You need time to separate genuine support from hidden expectations. But that decision created a distance I never expected. People who once trusted me started questioning me. People who once stood beside me started looking at me differently. And that was when I realized the death of my husband had started a second loss. The first loss was losing him. The second loss was discovering that some relationships I believed were permanent were not as strong as I thought. And what happened next would change the way I viewed family, trust, and money forever. Because the inheritance was not the biggest challenge I faced. It was only the beginning. Behind the $28 million was a story my husband never had the chance to explain. A story about preparation. A story about trust. And a story about what happens when people believe they deserve a part of something they did not build. That was the moment my life entered a chapter I never expected to live. And the truth I discovered afterward changed everything. The more I tried to protect what my husband had built, the more I realized that the inheritance was never just about money. It was about trust, responsibility, and discovering what people truly value when there is something significant at stake. After my husband passed away, I thought the hardest part would be learning how to live without him. I was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to move forward while carrying a responsibility I never expected to have. Because when someone leaves behind wealth, people often focus on what is gained. They talk about the opportunities. They talk about the lifestyle. They talk about the freedom. But very few people talk about the weight that comes with it. Very few people talk about the fear of making the wrong decision. Very few people talk about the pressure of knowing that one careless choice could affect everything someone spent a lifetime building. And that was the position I found myself in. I was not looking at a fortune. I was looking at my husband's life's work. I was looking at the future he had spent years preparing for. I was looking at something that represented his sacrifices, his discipline, and his desire to protect the people he loved. The inheritance was valued at around $28 million. Along with it came ownership connected to a skyscraper, an asset that represented not just financial value, but years of planning and commitment. To anyone looking from the outside, it probably seemed like a dream. But when you are suddenly responsible for something that large, the first feeling is not excitement, it is uncertainty. Because money has a way of making simple decisions complicated. Before my husband died, I never imagined myself sitting in a room surrounded by financial documents, legal information, and decisions that could shape the rest of my life. I was never prepared for that moment. Nobody teaches you what to do when the person who always handled the future is suddenly no longer there. Nobody teaches you how to separate your emotions from decisions that cannot wait. Nobody teaches you how to recognize the difference between people offering support and people trying to influence the outcome. And that was the part I struggled with the most. Because grief makes you vulnerable. When you lose someone you love, you naturally look for comfort. You look for familiar faces. You look for people who can remind you that you are not alone. But when wealth becomes part of the situation, comfort and interest can sometimes look very similar. At first, I wanted to believe everyone had good intentions. I wanted to believe every question came from concern. I wanted to believe every suggestion came from a desire to help. Because accepting that someone might see your loss as an opportunity is a painful reality. It forces you to reconsider relationships you thought were permanent. And I was not ready to do that. Not yet. So I did what I believed was necessary. I slowed everything down. I took time to understand. I kept certain details private until I knew exactly what decisions needed to be made. Some people might misunderstand that choice. They might think keeping information private means someone is trying to control something. But there is a difference between hiding something for personal gain and protecting something until you understand the situation clearly. When a person receives a large inheritance after losing someone they love, they are not only managing assets, they are managing emotions, they are managing expectations, they are managing relationships. And sometimes, the hardest thing to manage is the pressure from people who believe they have a right to influence your choices. I learned that wealth creates a strange situation. When people see someone become successful, they often see the result. They see the house, they see the business, they see the numbers. But they rarely see the years behind it. They do not see the sacrifices. They do not see the difficult decisions. They do not see the moments when that person had to choose patience over comfort. My husband understood that. He knew that building something valuable required discipline. But after he was gone, I began to understand something else. Protecting wealth can require just as much discipline as creating it. Because suddenly, everyone has an opinion. Everyone has advice. Everyone has a reason why their perspective should matter. And sometimes those opinions are not completely wrong. That is what makes situations like this so difficult. People are not always acting out of obvious selfishness. Sometimes they genuinely believe they are helping. Sometimes they believe they understand what is best. Sometimes emotions and expectations become so mixed together that people cannot even recognize their own motivations. That was one of the biggest lessons I learned. Human relationships are complicated. Money does not always create conflict. Sometimes it simply exposes conflicts that were already hidden beneath the surface. Before the inheritance became a topic of discussion, our relationships felt natural. People visited because they wanted to spend time together. People called because they cared. Conversations were about memories, family, and everyday life. But after the existence of significant assets became part of the conversation, the atmosphere slowly changed. The questions became more specific. The opinions became stronger. The feeling that I was being watched became harder to ignore. And that feeling is something I will never forget. Because it is a strange experience when you begin wondering whether people are seeing you or seeing what you have. You start noticing small things, the way someone asks a question, the urgency behind certain conversations. The difference between someone saying, "How are you doing?" and someone asking, "What are you going to do with everything?" Those two questions may sound similar, but they feel completely different. One comes from compassion. The other comes from curiosity about something valuable. And slowly, I began understanding why my husband had always been careful about planning. He knew that wealth does not only attract opportunities, it attracts attention. And not all attention comes from the right place. That realization changed the way I viewed financial security. For most of my life, I thought being financially secure meant having enough money. But I discovered something deeper. True financial security is not just about the amount you have. It is also about your ability to make thoughtful decisions. It is about understanding what you own. It is about knowing who should have influence over those decisions. It is about having the courage to slow down when everyone else is pushing you to move faster. And that is why I refused to make decisions based only on pressure. Because I knew something important. Once a decision is made with money, it can be difficult to undo. A conversation can be repaired, a misunderstanding can be corrected, but certain financial choices can change the future permanently. The more I learned, the more I realized my husband's inheritance was not simply something he left behind. It was a responsibility he trusted me to handle, and that responsibility forced me to become someone I had never been before. Someone more careful, someone more aware, someone willing to ask difficult questions. Because love does not mean ignoring reality, and kindness does not mean allowing others to make choices for you. Sometimes protecting what matters requires boundaries, even with people you love, especially with people you love. Looking back, I believe the inheritance revealed something that money often reveals. It showed who was interested in the person and who was focused on the possession. It showed who respected my decisions and who wanted to influence them. But what I did not know at that time was that the inheritance was only one part of the story. The money created questions. The property created pressure. But the real conflict was not about the assets themselves. The real conflict was about control. And soon, I would discover that some people were not only interested in knowing what my husband left behind, they wanted a say in what happened next. And that was when everything began to change. The moment I realized the inheritance was no longer just a financial responsibility, but something that was changing the way people saw me, I understood that the real battle was not going to be about money itself. It was going to be about relationships, expectations, and the invisible lines that appear when people believe they have something to gain. And that was the moment I began to understand a painful truth. Money does not always create new problems. Sometimes, it simply reveals the problems that were already there. After I made the decision to slow things down and carefully manage what happened next, I noticed a shift. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything changed overnight. That would have almost been easier. Instead, it happened gradually. Small conversations became uncomfortable. Simple questions started carrying different meanings. People who once spoke to me with warmth began speaking with a sense of expectation. And the hardest part was that I could not simply point to one specific action and say, "This is the moment everything changed." Because human relationships are rarely that simple. The people around me were not strangers. They were people who had shared memories with my husband, people who had been part of our lives, people who knew our story. And that made everything more confusing. Because when someone you barely know disappoints you, it hurts. But when someone you trusted begins making you question their intentions, it changes the way you see the world. I found myself replaying conversations in my mind. I started asking questions I never thought I would ask. Was this always there? Did I just never notice it? Did money create this change, or did money simply reveal something that was already hidden? Those questions stayed with me because I did not want to believe the worst about people I cared about. I wanted to believe that everyone was acting from a place of love. I wanted to believe that everyone was simply trying to process the situation in their own way. And maybe some of them were. That is the complicated part. Not every disagreement comes from bad intentions. Not every concern is manipulation. Not every opinion is selfish. But when emotions, grief, and financial interests become connected, even ordinary conversations can become difficult to understand. And that is where trust becomes fragile. After my husband's death, I noticed something about the way people talked about the inheritance. They rarely talked about what it meant emotionally. They rarely talked about the responsibility behind it. Instead, conversations often focused on decisions, numbers, plans, possibilities. It was as if the human story behind the assets was slowly disappearing. And that bothered me. Because to me, this was not just a financial situation. This was connected to a person I loved. A person who was no longer here to explain his thoughts. A person who trusted me to handle what came next. The skyscraper was not just a building. The inheritance was not just money. They were pieces of a life. They represented years of effort. They represented choices my husband made when nobody was watching. And I began to realize that people often see the result of success without understanding the journey behind it. They see what someone owns. They do not always see what someone sacrificed. They see the reward. They do not always see the responsibility. That difference in perspective created tension. Because when someone sees an asset, they may think about value. But when someone sees a legacy, they think about meaning. And those two viewpoints can lead people in completely different directions. I remember moments when I felt like I had to defend decisions I had not even fully made yet. I felt pressure to explain myself, pressure to reassure others, pressure to move faster than I was emotionally prepared to move. But inside, I was still trying to understand my own reality. I was still grieving. I was still adjusting to a future I never planned for. And suddenly, I was expected to make decisions involving millions of dollars while people around me were watching every move. That pressure is something many people never consider when they imagine wealth. They imagine the freedom. They imagine the comfort. They imagine having options. But they rarely imagine the responsibility of being the person everyone is looking toward. Because when you have something valuable, everyone suddenly has an opinion. Some opinions come from wisdom. Some come from concern. Some come from personal expectations. And the difficult part is learning the difference. That was one of the hardest lessons I had to learn. I had spent my life believing that family meant trust. I believed family meant people would protect each other during difficult moments. But I discovered that family relationships can become complicated when money becomes involved. Not because family is meaningless, not because love disappears, but because money can create pressure that exposes different priorities. Some people begin thinking about what is fair. Some people begin thinking about what they deserve. Some people begin thinking about what they believe should happen. And when those beliefs are different, conflict becomes almost impossible to avoid. I started noticing a change in the way certain conversations happened. There was more urgency, more pressure, more focus on outcomes, and less focus on how I was coping. That was painful. Because after losing my husband, I did not need people fighting over what came next. I needed people who remembered what I had just lost. I needed people who understood that behind every decision was a person trying to rebuild a life. But instead, I began feeling like I had to separate my grief from my responsibilities. I had to be careful. I had to think clearly. I had to protect myself while still trying to remain compassionate. And that balance was incredibly difficult, because there is a common misunderstanding about boundaries. Some people believe setting boundaries means you no longer care. But I learned that boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about protecting what matters. They are about creating enough space to make thoughtful decisions instead of emotional ones. And when significant wealth is involved, emotional decisions can have consequences that last for years. One of the biggest lessons I learned from this experience is that financial problems are often not really about money. They are about people. They are about beliefs. They are about expectations. They are about the stories people tell themselves about what they deserve. Money simply brings those things to the surface. Think about it. If there was no inheritance, would everyone still have the same conversations? Would everyone still have the same level of interest? Would everyone still be involved in the same way? Those were questions I could not stop asking, because the situation forced me to look at relationships differently. Before this happened, I measured trust by history, by memories, by years of knowing someone. But afterward, I learned that trust is also revealed through behavior during difficult moments. Anyone can be supportive when everything is easy. Anyone can celebrate when there is nothing to lose. But difficult situations reveal something deeper. They reveal patience. They reveal respect. They reveal whether someone values the person or only the outcome. And slowly, I began accepting that some relationships might never return to the way they were before. That realization was painful, because sometimes losing trust feels like losing someone who is still alive. There is no funeral. There is no goodbye. There is only the quiet realization that the relationship you thought you had no longer exists in the same way. But through that pain, I also learned something about myself. I learned that protecting what my husband built did not make me cold. It did not make me selfish. It meant I was taking seriously the responsibility he left behind. Because wealth without wisdom can disappear quickly. And money without protection can become a source of conflict instead of security. My husband spent years building something valuable. My responsibility was not simply to preserve the assets, it was to preserve the purpose behind them. And that meant making difficult choices, even when those choices disappointed people, even when those choices created distance, even when those choices forced me to stand alone. But I still did not know how far things would go. I did not yet understand that the tension around the inheritance was only the beginning. Because as more people became involved, the question was no longer just about what my husband had left behind. The question became, who had the right to decide what happened next? And that was when the conflict moved from uncomfortable conversations to something much deeper. A battle over control. A battle over influence. And a battle that would test everything I believed about family, loyalty, and trust. The moment I realized the conflict was no longer about understanding the inheritance, but about who had the power to influence my decisions, I knew I was facing something much bigger than a disagreement over money. I was no longer trying to answer the question, what should happen to my husband's assets? I was facing a much harder question. Who still respected my right to decide? And that question changed everything. Because there is a difference between people offering advice and people trying to take control. At first, I struggled to see that difference. I kept telling myself that everyone involved was simply trying to help. I kept reminding myself that grief affects people differently. I kept searching for explanations that would allow me to believe the best about those around me. But eventually, I had to accept something painful. Sometimes, people can care about you and still allow their own expectations to influence their actions. Sometimes, people can believe they are helping while slowly crossing boundaries. And sometimes, protecting yourself means accepting that not everyone will understand your choices. After my husband's death, I never wanted a fight. That is important for people to understand. I did not wake up one morning wanting conflict. I did not want to create distance between myself and people who had been part of my life for years. I did not want to become the person who had to question every conversation. But circumstances changed. The inheritance changed the environment around me. The decisions became more complicated. And the more valuable the assets became, the more opinions appeared. Suddenly, people who had never been involved in financial decisions before had strong ideas about what should happen next. They had suggestions. They had expectations. They had reasons why their perspective should carry more weight. And the difficult part was that many of those conversations sounded reasonable on the surface. That is what made everything so confusing. Conflict rarely begins with someone openly saying, "I want control." Usually, it begins with something much softer. A suggestion, a concern, a question. A statement that sounds like protection. "I just want to make sure everything is handled correctly. I think this decision would be better. You should consider what everyone else wants." Each sentence alone may not seem harmful, but when you hear them repeatedly, when you feel the pressure building, you begin to recognize a pattern. The conversation is no longer about support. It is about influence. And that realization was one of the hardest moments for me, because I had to separate love from control. I had to understand that someone caring about me did not automatically mean they had the right to make decisions for me. That was a lesson I never expected to learn. Growing up, I was taught that family means standing together, and I still believe that. But I also learned that healthy relationships require respect. Respect for boundaries, respect for decisions, respect for another person's ability to think, choose, and carry responsibility. Without that respect, even family relationships can become complicated. As the situation continued, I began feeling like I was constantly explaining myself. I found myself defending decisions before they were even made. I felt pressure to justify why I needed time, why I wanted to understand everything, why I was being careful. But something inside me kept reminding me of one important truth. My husband trusted me with this responsibility, and if I rushed into decisions simply because other people wanted answers, I would not be honoring that trust. That thought gave me strength, because when someone you love is gone, you search for ways to continue their presence in your life. For me, protecting what he built became one of those ways. Not because I cared more about money than people, but because I cared about the meaning behind what he created. The inheritance represented more than financial value. It represented years of discipline. It represented sacrifices. It represented choices he made when nobody else saw them. And I felt a responsibility to approach those choices with the same level of care. But the more I tried to protect that responsibility, the more tension grew. The people around me began seeing my caution differently. Some interpreted it as distance. Some interpreted it as a lack of trust. Some believed I was making things more complicated than necessary. But what they did not understand was that I was carrying a burden they could not see. They saw decisions. I felt consequences. They saw assets. I saw a future that needed to be protected. That difference created a gap between us. And slowly, I began experiencing something I never expected. I felt like a stranger in a place that was supposed to feel like home. That feeling is difficult to describe, because being excluded by strangers hurts. But feeling alone among people you once considered family is a different kind of pain. It makes you question your memories. It makes you question your judgment. It makes you wonder whether you misunderstood the relationship all along. I remember asking myself, did they really know me? Did they really care about me? Or did this situation simply reveal a side of them I had never seen before? Those questions were painful because there were no easy answers. Human beings are complicated. People are not simply good or bad. They are influenced by emotions, fears, experiences, and beliefs. And money can bring all of those things to the surface. One thing I learned throughout this experience is that financial conflict is rarely only financial. It is emotional. It is personal. It is connected to identity, fairness, and expectations. Everyone has their own story about what they believe is right. Everyone has their own idea of what they deserve. And when those stories collide, even people who love each other can become opponents. That was the reality I was facing. A family disagreement slowly becoming a struggle over control. And the hardest part was realizing that I could not control how other people reacted. I could only control how I responded. That was when I started focusing less on convincing everyone to understand me, and more on making decisions I could live with. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with pressure is trying too hard to gain everyone's approval. But when the stakes are high, approval cannot be the foundation of your decisions. Wisdom has to be. Clarity has to be. Responsibility has to be. I began learning that saying no does not mean you do not love someone. Creating boundaries does not mean you hate someone. Protecting yourself does not mean you are selfish. Sometimes, it means you finally understand the value of what you are responsible for. And I needed to understand that before things became even more difficult. Because eventually, the conversations changed. The pressure increased. The emotional distance became impossible to ignore. The situation reached a point where I could no longer pretend everything would return to normal. There was a moment when I realized something had shifted permanently. The people who once welcomed me were no longer approaching me the same way. The place where I once felt safe no longer felt completely safe, and that realization was heartbreaking. Because losing a relationship is one thing, but losing the version of that relationship you believed existed is another. It feels like grieving someone who is still alive. You are not mourning a person, you are mourning an expectation. You are mourning the belief that certain people would always choose you. But even in that painful moment, I discovered something important. I discovered my own strength. For the first time, I stopped asking, how do I make everyone happy? And I started asking, what is the right thing to do? That shift changed me. Because sometimes life places you in situations where you have to choose between being liked and being responsible. and those choices are never easy, but they reveal who you are. My husband spent his life building something valuable, and after he was gone, my challenge was not only protecting the assets, my challenge was protecting the values behind them. Integrity, responsibility, thoughtful decision-making. Those things mattered more than any number on a document. But I still did not know how far this situation would go. I did not yet understand that the struggle over influence would eventually become a struggle over access. That the people questioning my decisions would soon challenge my place in the very life my husband and I had built. Because the next chapter was not about uncomfortable conversations anymore. It was about losing control. It was about being pushed away from something I thought I still belonged to. And it was about discovering what happens when the people closest to you decide that your choices are no longer enough. The moment I stopped trying to hold together something that was already changing, I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding for so long. The greatest loss was never the money, the property, or the inheritance. The greatest loss was realizing that some relationships only felt unbreakable because life had never given them a reason to be tested. And when that test finally came, everything became clear. For a long time, I believed the ending of this story would be about what happened to the $28 million inheritance. I thought people would want to know who gained what. I thought people would focus on the skyscraper, the assets, and the financial decisions. But after everything I experienced, I realized something much deeper. The real story was never about what was left behind. The real story was about what was revealed. Because money has a strange way of bringing hidden things into the light. It reveals priorities. It reveals expectations. It reveals the difference between people who stand beside you and people who stand beside what you have. And perhaps the hardest lesson I learned was that wealth does not just test your ability to manage money. It tests your ability to manage relationships, emotions, and yourself. When my husband was alive, I never imagined I would one day have to make decisions without him. I never imagined I would have to defend choices that were made with careful thought and responsibility. I never imagined I would have to explain why protecting something valuable was not the same as refusing to share it. But life does not always ask us if we are ready. Sometimes, it places us in situations where we have to grow because there is no other choice. That was what happened to me. I had spent so much time trying to make everyone understand my perspective. I tried to explain my intentions. I tried to show people that my decisions were not coming from selfishness or greed. They were coming from responsibility. But eventually, I realized something important. You cannot force someone to understand your heart if they have already decided what they want to believe. And that realization was painful. Because we often believe that if we explain ourselves clearly enough, people will eventually see the truth. But sometimes, the issue is not a lack of information. Sometimes, the issue is that people are looking at the same situation through completely different motivations. I was looking at my husband's legacy. Others were looking at the possibilities created by that legacy. I was thinking about protecting the future. Others were thinking about what role they should have in that future. And when those perspectives are different, even the most careful conversations can become difficult. Eventually, I had to stop asking myself, how do I make everyone happy? Because that question was destroying my peace. Instead, I started asking a different question. What decision will allow me to look back years from now and know I acted with integrity? That question changed everything. Because approval from others can disappear. People's opinions can change. Circumstances can change. But living with your own choices is something you carry forever. That was when I began understanding what true financial responsibility really means. Many people believe protecting wealth means protecting money. But I learned that protecting wealth is much bigger than that. It means protecting the decisions behind the money. It means protecting the purpose behind the assets. It means protecting the values that created that wealth in the first place. A person can inherit millions and still lose everything if they lack wisdom. A person can have valuable assets and still destroy their future through emotional decisions. Because money itself is not what creates security. Knowledge creates security. Preparation creates security. The ability to think clearly under pressure creates security. And that was a lesson I wish more people understood. We spend so much time learning how to earn. We learn how to build careers. We learn how to increase income. We learn how to create opportunities. But very few people learn how to protect what they build when life becomes complicated. Very few people prepare for the emotional side of wealth. The conversations, the expectations, the pressure from people who suddenly become interested, the responsibility of making choices when everyone has an opinion. That is the side of wealth nobody talks about. The side that does not appear in advertisements. The side that does not appear in success stories. The side that only appears when something important is at risk. And through this experience, I discovered something about family. Family is not only defined by shared history, it is defined by how people treat each other when circumstances become difficult. Anyone can be supportive during celebrations. Anyone can smile when there is nothing to lose. But difficult moments reveal something deeper. They reveal patience. They reveal respect. They reveal whether someone values the relationship or simply the result they hope to achieve. That realization hurt me, because accepting the truth meant letting go of an image I had carried for years. I had to accept that some people could have been part of my life without necessarily being the people I thought they were. And that is a painful thing to understand. Because sometimes the hardest goodbye is not saying goodbye to a person. It is saying goodbye to the version of them you believed existed. But as painful as that realization was, it also gave me clarity. I stopped measuring relationships only by how long I had known someone. I started measuring them by how they acted when things became difficult. I stopped believing that love meant allowing everyone access to every decision. I learned that love also requires honesty, respect, and boundaries. And boundaries are not walls designed to punish people. They are protection. They are a way of saying, this matters, this responsibility matters, this relationship matters, this future matters. Looking back now, I understand that my husband left me more than an inheritance. He left me a lesson about responsibility, a lesson about people, a lesson about strength. Because before this happened, I thought strength meant having someone beside you who could help you carry the weight. After this happened, I learned that sometimes strength means discovering you can carry it yourself. I learned that being misunderstood does not mean you are wrong. I learned that making difficult decisions does not mean you lack compassion. And I learned that protecting what matters sometimes requires standing firm, even when standing firm feels lonely. The inheritance changed my life, but not because it gave me something. It changed my life because it forced me to see something. It showed me that money is never just money. Money is connected to dreams, to sacrifices, to memories, to relationships. And when something carries that much meaning, it deserves to be handled with wisdom. If there is one thing I hope people take away from my story, it is this. Do not wait until a crisis happens to talk about the things that matter most. Do not wait until emotions are high to discuss responsibility. Do not assume love alone is enough to protect what you have built. Love is important, but preparation matters too. Communication matters too. Understanding matters too. Because the people we love are not always prepared for the situations life creates. And sometimes, the best way to protect a family is not by avoiding difficult conversations. It is by having them before they become necessary. Today, when I look back at everything that happened, I no longer see only the pain. I see the lessons. I see the growth. I see the person I became because I was forced to face something I never expected. My husband's death changed my life. The inheritance changed my relationships. But the experience changed me. It taught me that true wealth is not only measured by what you own, it is measured by your wisdom, your character, your ability to make thoughtful choices when emotions are at their strongest. Because in the end, money can reveal many things about the people around you. But the most important thing it can reveal is who you become when everything you thought you could rely on begins to change. And that was the greatest inheritance I received. Not the money, not the property, but the strength to understand myself, protect my future, and move forward with peace. Get hook. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized the inheritance was never the biggest challenge I faced. The money, the property, and the financial decisions were only the surface of a much deeper story. The real challenge was discovering how people respond when love, loss, and wealth become connected. It was about understanding human nature when circumstances change and when something valuable suddenly enters the picture. I learned that money does not create someone's character. It reveals it. The people around us often show their true priorities during moments of pressure. When everything is easy, it is simple to say the right words, offer support, and promise loyalty. But when difficult decisions appear, actions become much louder than promises. This experience taught me that protecting what matters is not the same as being selfish. Setting boundaries is not the same as pushing people away. Sometimes, making responsible decisions means accepting that not everyone will agree with you. One of the greatest lessons I discovered is that wealth is not only about what we own. True wealth is also about wisdom, preparation, and the ability to make thoughtful choices when emotions are high. Many people spend their lives learning how to earn money, but very few prepare themselves for the responsibility that comes after success arrives. They prepare for opportunity, but they do not prepare for pressure. They prepare for growth, but they do not prepare for protecting what they have built. The lesson we can apply to our own lives is simple. Do not wait until a crisis happens to have important conversations. Talk with your family about financial responsibilities. Create clear plans for unexpected situations. Learn about the assets you own. Understand that love and trust are important, but preparation and communication are equally important. Because when life changes suddenly, emotions can make decisions much harder. Having a clear understanding before difficult moments arrive can protect not only your finances, but also your relationships. Another important lesson is to pay attention to how people treat you when circumstances become complicated. True support is not measured by what someone says when everything is comfortable. It is revealed by how they respect you when they disagree with your choices. In the end, the greatest inheritance was not the money or the property. It was the wisdom gained from facing uncertainty. It was learning to trust myself. It was understanding that sometimes protecting your future requires courage, patience, and the willingness to make difficult decisions. Because the true measure of wealth is not only what you leave behind, it is the character, wisdom, and strength you develop while carrying it forward. Now, I want to ask you a simple question. If you suddenly received a large inheritance, what would be the first thing you would do? Protect it? Share it with family? Or invest it for the future? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective, and your answer may help others see this situation from a different point of view. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to continue creating more deep and valuable stories like this in the future. Thank you for being here and joining us on this journey.